Thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us today. My name is Evelyn Goh, and I convene the Women in Asia Pacific Security Research Seminar Series, which you have just joined. Before we go any further, please let me acknowledge the first Australians on whose lands we meet. I'm currently in Canberra, so let me pay our respects to the Ngunnawal people and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to the second of this seminar series. Today we've got Oriana Skylar Mastro, who is going to give a research seminar. Before I turn over to Oriana, please allow me to remind our audience, some of whom may be new to the seminar series, that the purpose of this seminar series is to showcase the research of women scholars who work on Asia Pacific security, broadly defined. I'd like to also remind you that our call for papers and presentations is still open, and with a deadline of the 15th of December. So if you go to our project seminar series website, you will be able to find the details of that. We will arrange for the website link to be put up in the chat box in the next few minutes. And if you're joining us via the YouTube recording, the details will be available at the bottom of following the video recording on the YouTube channel. Today's seminar will be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Sue Thompson from the ANU's National Security College. Before I hand over to Sue, please just let me introduce her to you. Sue is Senior Lecturer at the National Security College, which is located in the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the Australian National University. Sue's research specialization is in the history of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia during the Cold War. She focuses in that area of specialization specifically on foreign and strategic policy issues in Southeast Asia. She's also translated some of that historical work into contemporary implications for regional cooperation in Southeast Asia. I'm going to hand over to Sue and let her run the rest of this seminar. Sue, over to you.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and thank you for that introduction. And it's my great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to chair this session. It sounds like it's going to be a really interesting session, and I'm looking forward to the presentation very much. So it's my pleasure right now to kickstart this session with Oriana, who Evelyn has introduced briefly prior to me, but for those of you who haven't seen the flyer, Oriana Mastro is a Centre Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies at Stanford University, and she's a Foreign and Defence Policy Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the inaugural Wilson Center China Fellow. She's an international security specialist with the research focusing on Chinese military and security policy, war termination and coercive diplomacy. And today's presentation, she's going to be talking to us about alliances, and I'm actually looking forward to this. I look into alliances a little bit in my historical work, but certainly not from a contemporary perspective. And it sounds very interesting what Oriana is trying to achieve. So I will pass it on to you now.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me, both in your country. I'm calling you from Coogee, from Sydney, so I am very happy to be here in Australia and not be in the United States, and also have the opportunity to present to you some research in progress. I think for these research seminars, there's sort of two types of research that scholars present. One type is something they've worked on for years, that they've done and presented so many times. They have heard all the feedback, they have smart answers to all the feedback, and they're just kind of honing their argument here and there. The second type is one which I think is more interesting, but a little bit more embarrassing to present, which is the works in progress, where you get feedback when you're stuck, you're having issues with certain things, and you get to discuss it with other scholars in the field to help you move forward. This project is definitely of the latter type. I started working on it a couple months ago and thought this would be, I would have a quick answer to an easy question, and instead have found that the situation is much more complicated than I thought it was. And so today I'm going to present to you some of my ideas about alignment, and in particular, trying to use international relations theory and international security studies to understand what's going on between China and Russia. So I'll present some of my initial ideas and also some of my current questions and confusions to see if together we can move forward on that. So I do have a presentation. I think that Kian is going to share her screen to go through that. So I'll just wait for her to get that started. And then we'll just put that in presentation mode or in slideshow mode. Perfect. All right. So for those of you who don't know, I know Rohan, since we were at Princeton together. I was a student of Tom Christensen's, and one of, I think, his greatest works was Posing Problems Without Catching Up, about how the Chinese military doesn't have to be a pure competitor of the United States to create issues. So I have piggybacked off of that title and have called this discussion Posing Problems Without Shacking Up, which gives you a little hint at what I'm going to say about China-Russia relations and East Asian security. Slide. So why do we care about China and Russia? Well, the biggest reason is that historically it's always been a factor in US strategy and the strategy of our allies and partners like Australia, that it is a serious threat to us if you have a country that is dominating the Eurasian landmass. And so I have two quotes here. One is from the 1988 National Security Strategy. This is sort of the famous quote, and one from the 2017 National Security Strategy. The first one says that part of US strategy is this conviction that the most basic national security interests would be endangered if a hostile state or group of states were to dominate the Eurasian landmass. And since 1945, we, in this case the United States, has sought to prevent the Soviet Union from capitalizing on its geostrategic advantages to dominate its neighbors in Western Europe, Asia, and Middle East in order to alter the global balance of power in their favor. 2017, a couple decades later, we have this assessment on the part of the US government that China and Russia are challenging American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. So the idea is that China and Russia are both revisionist powers that present a challenge to the United States. And there's always been this view of what's worse than having one revisionist power is two. What's worse than having two is if those two powers came together to coordinate in order to more efficiently and more effectively challenge the things that we hold dear. And it's not only obviously important for the United States. I have a quote here as well from the Danish Institute for International Studies that basically says that when the United States threats towards China and Russia increase, when they reach a certain point, a Sino-Russian alliance could become a harsh reality for the United States and the Western order. So part of the concern of the 2017 National Security Strategy was this idea that is the United States creating this coalition by calling out China and Russia, by putting both of them on the spot, making, potentially enhancing the threat perceptions in both Beijing and Moscow of the United States? Are we pushing these two together? And if so, is that a problem for the United States and its allies and partners? Slide, please. So being a good political scientist, the first thing I sort of always do when I want to answer a question is to go to the literature. Surely someone has come up with a better answer than I can come up with. So I can answer this question for myself, which I think has a lot of policy relevance, call it a day, move on to my next projects. So one thing that is clear is there is a huge debate about how to understand the nature of the relationship between China and Russia. So from the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment, I have this quote, that these two countries are more aligned than they have been at any point since the mid-1950s, that they, quote, seek to shape the international system and regional security dynamics and exert influence over politics and the economies of states in all regions of the world, and especially in their backyards. So from the US government's perspective, these countries are coming together. But then you go into the political science literature, and the literature on area studies that look specifically at China and Russia, and you get, as I have here, a list of what is being described. You have some type of alliance, political military alliance, veritable alliance, de facto alliance, tacit alliance. Some people say, sure, it's not a full-fledged alliance, but it's moving in that direction. Others say, no. It's not even, it's rapprochement or non-aggression pact or, strategic partnership, but it's not an alliance. So I have read hundreds of reports on China and Russia, and in the end, it seems like there's no consensus on how to understand this relationship. Slide, please. In addition to, how should we understand the relationship, there's a secondary debate on whether or not this matters at all, right? Like, are these two countries going to come close together? And if so, are they going to have any impact if they do? So there are lists of reasons that scholars give about why they're not going to come close enough to have an impact. Those are things like historic mistrust, military and economic asymmetries, different stakes in the international order, conflicting positions on some foreign policy issues. And then some say it is the time to worry because these are two autocracies with shared interests that their primary goal is to undermine the US-led international order. And they have shared threat perceptions. And historically, that's all you need in an alliance, right? The Soviet Union was allied with the United States, during World War II. We didn't share a lot of common interests except our need to defeat, Japan and Germany, right? So maybe that's enough, and that pushes them together. There is a host of debates. Some people say, no, this alignment is going to be problematic because it's asymmetric. China needs Russia more. Others say Russia needs China more. Some people say they're very closely aligned militarily, but not aligned in the political and economic sphere. Other people say they're very closely aligned politically and economically, but not in the military sphere. So in the end, there's this broad range of opinions from everything from China and Russia hate each other, so we shouldn't worry about it, to China and Russia are basically in a full-fledged alliance to counter everything that we hold dear. So this range of the debate to me suggests that we haven't honed in on what we are actually trying to study. Slide, please. So I gave this a lot of thought. And of course, one of the reasons you do these seminar series is right before, like a couple of days ago, I had what I hope is a breakthrough about how to think about this. I kept on going back and forth, and I tried to assess, like, well, some people use these variables, other people use those variables, like which variables are important, which variables aren't important. And I just took a step back and asked from, doing policy relevant research, which is really something that I focus on. Why do we care? Like, what is it that we actually want to know? And what we actually want to know is, China and Russia, are they forming a countervailing coalition against the United States, its allies, and the US world order? We're looking at intentions. That's one component. The second component is, what form is some alignment going to take? How deep is it going to be? And deep also usually deals with duration as well. Is it transactional, short-term, or is it enduring? What's the scope of the alignment? And this is one thing I'll talk about in great detail, because I think some of the literature, it's either they're aligned or not, but all alliances have a scope, right? Even the United States and Japan, like Japan is not planning on defending the United States. The scope of the alignment is the defense of Japan. That doesn't mean the two countries aren't deeply aligned. It means that the scope is limited. So I think we need to separate those two things out. And one of the things I'll talk about a lot today that I have really been thinking about is different types of states align in different ways. So a lot of the literature uses the same metrics to measure alignment between China and Russia. Those metrics are derived from understandings basically of US alliances with their partners that are more of a patron-client type of relationship. And so my first question is, great power partnerships, the alignment between two great powers, would it even take the same form as the United States with Japan or the United States with Australia, in which the commitments, the defense commitments and the defense resources are so asymmetric? And I come out on the side of no, that we have to weigh different metrics differently depending on which states are involved. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the follow-on slides. The last question we have here is, like, even if they have the intention, even if we get it right, what this alignment is going to look like, does it even matter? do the two sides have the capacity to actually pose any sort of threat to the United States and its allies? And here's a quote from John Mearsheimer, 2014, that, you know, he basically says that China and Russia are still far weaker than the United States and in no position to challenge the United States in any meaningful way. So maybe some scholars say, you know, who cares if these two countries come together? They're not going to pose a real threat. So my bottom line review of the literature is it seems like there's this reliance on very high standards, very narrow standards, and potentially irrelevant evidentiary threshold for what alliance is or what alignment is that may cause us to overlook some substantial efforts that China and Russia are undergoing to counter the United States and its allies and partners, especially in the context of Asia. Slide, please. So maybe it's my military training, but I always like to, you know, in case anyone's going to zone out for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to give you what my argument is before I build through it. And the bottom line is China and Russia are not going to form a formal military alliance. They're not going to fight together in the traditional sense. In the traditional sense, what I mean is the two militaries fighting in the same location in some sort of joint way. And they seem to be relatively uninterested in coordinating their policies towards third parties. So outside of their bilateral relationship of helping each other achieve certain goals in Asia, they are not expanding the scope of that alliance to coordinate what they do. But what is China and Russia's policy towards Syria, for example, or towards Afghanistan? That would be an additional complication. This doesn't mean that the relationship isn't problematic, hence the title of my talk. China-Russia alignment is deep. So it's not superficial, it's not transactional. It is deep, but it's limited in scope. And in my view, it's basically limited to helping China gain the position of being a hegemon in Asia. That is the limitation of the scope. And of course, that is a challenge to the international order, the US-led alliance system in Asia. But I think the scope is relatively limited to Asia. And even though the two sides are not going to be fighting together anytime soon, I think Russia is enhancing Chinese military capabilities in pivotal ways. So one of the things that literature on alignment does a lot is they separate internal and external measures, right? We know from political scientists, they say internal balancing, right? States can build their own militaries. External balancing, states can form alignments. But in a lot of cases, it is external countries that are helping you internally balance, right? So separating those two things out isn't very useful. And I would say a key part of the alignment is that Russia is helping China in significant ways in building its military. And I also think China and Russia might support each other indirectly in a contingency. So again, you know, war fighting is a very complex endeavor. It isn't just, you know, two sides, you know, with bayonets anymore fighting it out. There are a lot of supporting and enabling systems that go into war fighting. And so I think Russia is going to do a number of things that are going to help China, whether it is providing them with a strategic rear in which they're providing equipment and other support during a conflict, even providing, you know, satellite coverage, intel sharing, all this sort of logistics enabling things could help China prevail in a conflict, but it makes it very difficult for the United States to control escalation, right? If we want to impose costs on China and China basically has this safe haven or sanctuary, which is Russia, that they're working from, it's very hard to think about how you undermine their warfighting capabilities without bringing Russia into the conflict, which might you know, be very difficult to do. So controlling escalation, I think, becomes much more difficult. And even though the two sides are not coordinating towards third parties, and I don't think they have any interest in doing so, the obvious point here is that competing with two is harder than competing with one. So I think that the United States and its allies will only need to counter one at a time, because they do have different interests in different countries around the world, but it's still twice the effort because we have sort of two problematic countries we're dealing with. Slide, please. So how did I get to some of these conclusions? The first thing I did was spend a lot of time reading how other people defined alignment. I'm going to present to you what I have come up with my definition, which is strategic alignment describes the relationship between states in peacetime and in wartime, specifically the degree to which they purposefully coordinate security policies to support and protect each other to achieve mutually beneficial strategic objectives. There's a lot of different components of this definition. I'm happy to go into more in the question and answer, but I think some of the most important ones are alignment is something that's done purposefully, A lot of the literature equates alignment with like foreign policy preferences, like two countries have the same preferences, they are aligned. And that's a colloquial way of using alignment, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about sort of the strategic decision to come closer together. And I use mutually beneficial strategic objectives instead of shared interests, because I think a lot of times, especially with great powers, they might have completely different interests, but one might help one with their interest, another might help one with another interest, right? So as long as it's mutually beneficial, that's what's important. And it's in peacetime and in wartime, because we can't forget about great power competition, right? Wars are very rare. We might never have to fight, China at all, hopefully, let alone these two countries together. So how do they help each other compete against other countries in peacetime as well? Slide, please. So I come to this definition. The next thing to do is to come up with indicators of alignment. And what a lot of studies do, and what you are probably hoping to get from me today, is a list of these indicators, right? Things like arms sales, joint exercises, professional military education. How often do they meet? What is their total trade? What is their total investments? Like all these indicators, and then, map it onto the China-Russia relationship to say, yeah, these are the numbers. And then I assign some sort of weight to them. And then I come up with some sort of conclusion about alignment. The problem is what I mentioned in my argument, which is it seems like how states align depends on the nature of the state, but also what their goals are. And then, so that then creates the indicators, right? So obviously, if two countries do plan on fighting together, we'll look for indicators of, are they enhancing their ability to do joint operations together? The indicator is derived from what the main goal of the alignment is. And so in a lot of cases, they're not the same. There are many reasons, I think, for example, that great powers align differently than alignments between sort of patron-client type of relationships. That in some cases, certain indicators don't mean a lot in patron-client relationships, but are very significant between great powers and the other way around. So here's just a few examples of some of those. The first is great powers can go at it alone. Right? They don't have to do that autonomy versus security. China doesn't need Russia. China, the definition of a great power is one that can defend and protect itself against other great powers on its own and have a reasonable chance of prevailing. That is the definition of a great power. So what this means is I think any form of alignment is significant. If you're a smaller country, the fact that you're choosing to align with another country is not sort of surprising. And so strategically, it doesn't have the same significance as a China or Russia deciding to align with one another. And because there's this less need of security, there's less willingness to sacrifice autonomy. And so there's certain indicators that we think show alignment, like are they willing to host bases of the other country? Are they willing to put their forces under the command and control of another country? If you're a great power, China is not going to let Russia have a base in China. Russia is not going to let China have a base in Russia. The United States, and I have a few of the cases, and we can talk about them. They're very specific minor situations. Have U.S. troops been under the command of a non-U.S. commander? Right? These are just, great powers are not willing to make these types of sacrifices. And so a lot of the studies I see will take a look at this and say China and Russia are not aligned because they don't have bases in each other's countries. Like, are those the right metrics to be understanding what these two countries are doing? I would argue no. Also, in alignment, we're talking about defense. And I have a whole nother paper about revisionism and how I don't think that's a useful concept in general. So here I put unfulfilled ambitions. Listen, China and Russia, rising powers, they're not just trying to defend themselves, right? They have goals that they want to achieve. And so this idea of like a mutual defense treaty is going to be too risky for them. Right? Like Russia knows like China might have to fight a war over Taiwan, right? Like they don't want to be dragged into that war. So because the scope of the potential use of military force is wider for great powers than it is for a smaller country whose main purpose for alignment is just self-defense, you don't want to be so closely entangled because because of the fact that you know that there are going to be issues between countries in the future, between great powers. So a mutual defense treaty, whether the two countries have a mutual defense treaty, again, a non-aggression pact is very significant between great powers. You know, mutual defense treaty might be asking a bit too much. The next point I would say is force enhancement comes at a real risk. This is just a fancy way of saying when Russia tries to build China's military, or China tries to help Russia build its military, this is not costless, right? When the United States sells some aircraft to India, we don't worry that the Indian military is going to become more powerful than the United States. We don't worry about positional costs, like are they going to overtake us, or India's direct threat to the United States, because there's such a huge difference in power. But when great powers help each other build their militaries, this is a very risky proposition. And so again, arms sales between the United States and India might signal people might say, yes, that's alignment, but a low level of alignment. But when two great powers are willing to do it, that to me signals a higher level of alignment because it is more costly and more risky. And because, you know, these are two great powers, they have shared interests, they're going to be concerned about distributional gains, again, because of the power issue. If you're strengthening the other side, the more shared interests you have, maybe the more problems you have. So maybe in great power relationships, the indicator of the best condition for alignment is not how many shared interests they have, but how many sort of not shared interests do they have. Like in many cases, people say Russia's focused on Europe, China's focused on Asia, so they're not going to align. But with great powers, is this potentially the reason why they would align? In that their interests do not overlap, and so they can help each other gain those interests without having to worry about distributional gains. I would also say that because great powers are more capable, they have more options for what fighting together means. It isn't just this sort of joint under the command. Like I mentioned, there's logistical, you know, equipment, other types of support that a great power can offer another great power that can be useful. And lastly, I will say that alignment between great powers is more risky and therefore more costly and therefore greater signal than between patron-client, because it's more likely to spark a great power response, right? Two smaller countries are thinking of aligning. We might not be having this sort of research seminar on whether or not they're coming together, but at China and Russia, we focus on that. And so it is risky in that case. Slide, please. So I started thinking about, yes, it seems like great powers align differently. And in a very informal discussion with some of my colleagues at Stanford, one of them mentioned that it seems like what I'm trying to say is that on different countries, we have to weigh indicators in different ways depending on the country. So then I started to think, maybe I don't want to just say that great powers align differently. Maybe I want to think about this more broadly. And it seemed to me that the more I thought about it, the more indicators might be case specific. That the degree of power, absolute power and relative power and capability between two countries matters when deciding what is an indicator of alignment. That the nature of the threat matters, because the various contingencies that they're planning for determine strategy. Right. So if we think about, should we think more specifically about like, how could Russia help China in a Taiwan contingency? Then look at peacetime indicators are they building the capacity to do that or not? Would they be sort of contingency specific? For example, we might see that the ground forces, if China and Russia are engaging in military exercises, and this goes to my next point about disaggregating variables, but all those military exercises are ground exercises. You know, that doesn't really suggest that, you know, Russia is preparing to help China with a Taiwan contingency. So this brings me to my next sort of point about disaggregating variables, separating the wheat from the chaff. The question I ask of all the main variables that are used in the literature that then in this project I want to break up into more detail is the following. Under what conditions are arms sales, joint exercises, defense engagements, et cetera, a sign of alignment? And it seems to me that most of the literature just looks at arms sales exercises. And I'm going to give you one example here. I'm working on all of these different variables, but I'm going to give you one example of arms sales in which I think we need to disaggregate these variables, because these are behaviors or activities that most states now engage in. If you look at the recent defense white paper, they have a list in the back of all the exercises they do. All the arms sales that occur like this, these are sort of common things. So the question is, when is it a sign and when is it not a sign? And just like I mentioned before, if we're thinking about it being case specific, then China and Russia engaging in certain types of exercises that are irrelevant to the contingencies that China might be fighting with outside powers, then it seems like, you know, the scope of that alignment is not really of concern to the United States and its allies and partners. We have to really look at the details. What states are trying to accomplish will determine not only whether they, align, that should say, but also how. And in general, I'm interested very much in the how. Slide, please. So I sort of rethought this out just a couple of days ago as I was thinking about the why we would care type of thing, like what are the impacts? And so I'm very interested to see if you find this sort of framework at all useful. But I sort of asked myself this question and looked into the literature, of which I actually did not find as much as I thought I would. So any suggestions would be much appreciated. How do states help each other achieve foreign policy objectives? This is sort of alignment. Now I went back and forth of saying, like, is it security? It's not just military objectives, because it's also sort of that foreign, like building power. I want to basically say, how do they help each other build and exercise power? And so I'm kind of thinking about different ways to couch this, but that's the main question. You know, what can they do? And so I just brainstormed a few ideas. And I split them into 3 different categories: things that can be done unilaterally, sort of one side gives to the other, things that are done bilaterally between the 2 countries, and things that are done with third parties multilaterally on the international stage. And this is how I think of the scope of the alignment. Is it just one side to the other? Is it the 2 sides together? Or are they aligned in cooperation and coordination with all their foreign policies around the world? So unilateral, the first big thing is sort of force enhancement. One side can help build the military of another side. This could include training, advising, building institutional capacity, human capital, equipping and selling weapons. Bilaterally, you're trying to improve the ability to fight together. And I sort of put this in quotes because part of it, of course, is fighting jointly, fighting simultaneously. So I've asked a couple of defense planners, just out of curiosity, and maybe you want to think of your answer to this question as well, for those of you that do sort of military operational planning. Would it be harder to fight China and Russia in different theaters at the same time, or fight them together in one theater? Like, would we prefer that we have to deal with Russia in Europe and China in Asia at the same time, or that China and Russia are fighting together for armed unification of Taiwan and we're countering them together? Like, which is harder militarily? And I've gotten kind of a range of answers, but the focus when you look at the indicators is people are always looking for jointness. And I guess my point is that might not be how 2 great powers think about fighting wars. It might be simultaneous. And lastly, how can they help each other fight? You can do a lot of things together, like providing direct logistical support, equipment, intel sharing, use of satellites, sanctuary, right? We talk about sanctuary for terrorists, but also can be military bases. Like, if China is able to operate from Russia or able to get equipment from Russia, those are going to be targets outside of the reach of the United States, as long as Russia is not an active belligerent in that war. So one of the reasons I'm sort of listing all these things out is, and when I go through the example of arms sales, what will become clear is when you disaggregate the variables, you're going to be looking for certain things over other things, right? If I'm concerned with logistical support, like intel sharing, to me, it's more important not to say how many courses does a Chinese officer take in Russia. The question more likely is there an embed? Is there a liaison? Are these 2 countries trying to build their ability to share intel? That would be a sign that they are about to help each other versus, just sort of taking the courses. And the last one is multilateral. Are they coordinating to support each other's foreign policy objectives around the world? This could also include helping to protect each other from outside sources of pressure and coercion. So are they coordinating in that way to protect themselves? So are they organizing together pressure on someone else? They could also divert attention or resources by creating crises. This is something I hear a lot in the policy realm about China and Russia, the fear that while we're dealing with China, Russia is going to create some issues for us, or vice versa. But I haven't been able to find a lot in the academic literature on this. Of course, you have diversionary war theory, this idea that governments are trying to divert attention from domestic problems, but I don't see a lot of literature on governments trying to divert other countries' attention through external maneuvers. So if anyone has any ideas on that, I would greatly appreciate it. Slide, please. So let me just give you sort of one example of what I'm trying to do here. And the first one is taking an indicator that people use for alignment, and that is arms sales. Arms sales are rationally, theoretically, empirically a sign of alignment because they can improve the military effectiveness of an alliance. They add to the warfighting potential of a supplier state. They increase the capabilities of the recipient to weaken the security of a common adversary. So we see often alliance relationships of which arms sales are a component. A lot of the discussion, because again, it focuses on patron-client, is about how a country will sell arms in exchange for some sort of political gains, bases, commitments. They might want to cement positive relations with the foreign government, things of that sort. But looking at arms sales and volume, which is basically what people look at, is volume of arms sales between two countries as an indicator of alignment, is actually not very informative if you don't disaggregate the variable. And that's because arms sales are so common. If you think about every country in the world, every country buys something from somewhere else. And also there are both commercial and strategic reasons why states might sell arms. So we want to know, again, if you go back to my previous definition of alignment, I want to know, where are the strategic reasons? If it's just commercial, it's not really a sign of alignment to me. And so that's not as important. And so there's some work being done, and I have here Jen Spindell, who has a book coming out that says, if you sell certain prestige weapons or certain advanced weaponry, that is a better indicator of alignment than volume of sales, for example. Slide, please. So to the point of arms sales being so common, I just have this chart here about sort of the major exporters and importers, just to give you a sense of the fact that, just because two countries engage in some sort of arms relationship doesn't necessarily mean that they're coordinating defense policies in ways to help each other achieve security goals. Slide, please. So I have broken up arms sales by the scope and the depth of alignment. And for each of these categories, I have very long descriptions, but I'll sort of go through them. And this is what I mean by disaggregating the variables. And my hope is, and I'll talk a bit about joint exercises, of doing this for each. So the first one that I call the strategic provision of arms. This is just, a state giving another state weapons. This is unilateral. The next one is bilateral arms arrangements. That's production arrangements between the two countries. And the last is international coordination in this realm of arms sales. So the question is, where is China and Russia on this chart? So if you move then across, you're getting to, I would say, deeper and deeper alignment. So for example, if you look at the first line of providing arms, first you provide arms to target a common adversary. Then if you're more aligned, you're gonna be providing arms of advanced strategic or sensitive weapons, right? To me, it's a greater sign of alignment if you're helping a country build a nuclear weapon than if you're providing them with small arms, for example. And the last is, that two countries are really aligned if the provision of arms is strengthening one country so much that it negatively impacts the provider's relative power. Right. So this way, we know it has to be strategic in that they're making a strategic choice to give up their relative power for the sake of enhancing the military of another country. And so across this spectrum, you're accepting a loss of relative power in exchange for deeper alignment. Another reason I think when you go across the spectrum, you're getting greater alignment is because they demand deeper coordination. So if you go from the bilateral arms arrangements, there's different types of production. So people focus mainly on, do I sell arms to you? But there's actually a range of ways that a country can gain those types of equipment. Selling arms is the unilateral. When you move into the bilateral, you have things called collaborative production. So this is like licensed production and co-production. Are you allowing the other country to build your arms? The next is joint development. It's not that they're just building those arms, you are developing the technologies together. And the last one is technical assistance. You are helping the other country have their own indigenous capability to build those arms. And so there's a lot of research. Gilly and Gilly have a piece in International Security in which they talk about how difficult reverse engineering really is. Unless you have basically the industrial know-how and the expertise to develop a certain system. Well, technical assistance is that another country is giving you those things, right? So as you move across this, each of those types of arms arrangements require deeper coordination and less control over the future military of that country. So if you imagine Russia selling China something, if let's just say they have a falling out, Russia can stop providing those systems, stop providing maintenance updates, things like that. And those systems over time atrophy and don't become as relevant operationally. But if you provide China with the ability to build that system themselves, then you've lost some of that control, right? Because even if you have the falling out and you stop your future assistance, they already have the know-how, they already have the capabilities. So that less control over the future, I think, also signals greater alignment. The last one is international coordination. These are ways that I thought of in the arms realm. Two countries can coordinate. The first is mutual embargo protection. Do we see instances of China protecting Russia from arms embargoes and Russia protecting China from arms embargoes? The next one is primum non nocere, which is just to do no harm. Are they coordinating to not sell weapons to each other's other potential adversaries? And then the third is coordinating arms to third parties more generally. So do we see either deconfliction or together, like if China and Russia are both siding with one group in a civil war, that they're both providing arms to that country, that they're coordinating their arms sales processes to each other? I think that would, that level of coordination is an indication of deep alignment in the international sphere. Slide, please. So the unilateral, the force development, I talked a bit about this. When I look at the weapons that are being supplied, even within this, we know arms transfers is something that's focused on a lot. We call it security assistance. This isn't a form of grant, aid. This is when arms are just sort of given. So at the very least, we know there's no commercial reason for this, that it has to be strategic. So this is often a great sign of alignment. But this very rarely happens between great powers because great powers can't pay for things. So just because we don't see arms transfers between China and Russia, I wouldn't say that that means they're not aligned. It's just that this is exactly the type of thing that different types of states, these indicators mean different types of things. Probably when we're looking at force enhancement, we're thinking, are they getting non-lethal or lethal equipment? Advanced strategic and sensitive sectors, another reason that's a greater degree of alignment is that it comes often with a discussion of roles, missions, functions. So you are allowing another country to know more about your own strategic thinking and planning. And so there has to be a degree of trust for that to happen. And some of the sensitive sectors based on the literature, things like missile defense, nuclear submarines, hypersonic technology, these are listed as sensitive. And on impact, I also asked the question, do they mitigate a critical vulnerability? Like, what is the degree of alliance? Of reliance? Is it the case that Russia is providing China with certain things that it can't create on its own? To me, that shifts the balance of power more. So it is a greater sign of alignment than other types of activities. Slide, please. And why do we care about, this is connecting the impact, again, the why do we care with an indicator of alignment? The production process. If they are engaged in these sort of co-development, co-production types of arrangements, does this mean that in wartime, the state can serve as a strategic rear? Does that state help with mass mobilization? Like if China and Russia have co-production, does that mean that their industrial bases can both be used in a time of conflict so that China has a greater ability to mobilize than they would be otherwise, and a greater ability to sustain war fighting in a protracted conflict? So is Russia serving as a long-term, is it a reliable supplier in the long term? Does it seem like they, halt or call for embargoes as a means to pressure the other country? So the deeper the alignment, the less likely these types of things are going to be cut off. And then, of course, the question when you're looking at deep alignment is, do these arms arrangements change the balance of power in favor of the recipient state? Because what that suggests, again, is that the country is actively and strategically choosing alignment and sacrificing relative power in exchange for that. Slide, please. And then I talked a bit about the multilateral, the broader political competition. There are costs associated with helping another great power. For one, they might be competing with each other for arms sales, right? And there already are examples of China taking certain technologies that they've learned from Russia and then producing them and then outbidding Russia in sort of in arms sales packages to other countries. So you might think about how does it affect each other's ability to use arms sales as a tool to influence third parties? Obviously, the two sides want to be able to prevent the other from selling weapons to a potential adversary. And so there are ways that we could see both sides helping each other's military or their force enhancement through these different types of arms arrangements. And so the first thing I did, and a slide please, is I put together, and this is just a snapshot of a very long document of all the systems that Russia has sold to China. And then, what they are, what they do, what is their impact in certain contingencies, et cetera, to try to answer some of these questions that I posed in the chart. Slide, please. And this is sort of what I came up with. So I think there's evidence when you look at the arms relationship between China and Russia of these three, that we are in these three different brackets that I have circled. The scope does not extend beyond East Asia to the international arena. It's basically unidirectional. We see collaborative production, but that's kind of at the lower level of alignment in the bilateral arms relationship. But the nature is deep and long-term because there is a negative impact on balance of power, that both countries are not going to agree to this type of arrangement if they think there's a possibility, that tomorrow they're going to be enemies. Slide, please. So just to give you some examples within each of these categories, the first one I said, are they targeting a common adversary? A lot of these weapon systems, and I can go into more detail in the Q&A, the main focus is on denying U.S. conventional force advantages in Asia. It's very clear that the weapons that the two sides are coordinating and cooperating on are specifically designed to counter their common adversary, which is the United States. Are there advanced indications that they are sharing advanced or strategic technologies? Yes. You have the anti-air, anti-missile defense systems like the S-400. You have advanced aircraft, ground force equipment, which, you might not think ground force equipment is important in those contingencies, but, China and Russia do share a border. So at the very least, it does suggest that they don't think that they're going to be fighting a border war anytime soon. There is less cooperation in hypersonics and anti-submarine warfare than you might suspect. So this, I think, deserves a little bit more research of why is it the case that you don't see Russia helping China more in this area. It is very clear that China's military, partially due to Russia's support, has become more powerful with respect to Russia. And there's a lot of literature that says that one of the main reasons why after 2016, they restarted arms sales. So there was a period in which Russia stopped selling arms to China because they were upset about reverse engineering, but then they started them up again. And one of the main reasons given was the strategic need to counter the United States, but also that Russia no longer saw China as a threat. So one of the things, if you look at indicators of alignment, for great powers, in many cases, shared interests is less of an indicator to me than, because they're going to have conflicting interests. They're great powers. They have so many interests. So the question is, do they work actively to mitigate their conflicting interests? And so trying to reduce the threat between the two sides or mitigate some of the conflicting interests, those attempts to me are more informative than how many shared interests they have. There have been some mentions about joint development under discussion. I did not circle that bracket because this is sort of potential. A former ambassador, Fu Ying, mentioned that there had been discussions about joint development projects between the two sides. Putin recently mentioned that the two sides will launch a joint development of a possible early warning system. But right now, I don't see evidence that they have moved away from just collaborative production into the joint development stage. And there is a sort of a mutual dependency on both sides. China accounts for 20% of Russia's weapon exports at times. In some years, that's been high as 50%. And China relies on Russia because it can't get advanced weaponry in a lot of other places after the embargoes in Tiananmen. Slide, please. So some of my conclusions, just from the arms sales. The first is that Russia greatly enhances China's military capabilities. If you focus on the PRC's principal capabilities and technologies, Russia is helping them in significant ways to deny U.S. conventional force advantages in airspace and the maritime domain. The arms sales that have been sort of completed are very pivotal. The main exports from 2014 to 2019 were air defense systems, combat aircraft. These are these are areas where China has had difficulty building their own system. So if it wasn't for Russian intervention and help, that they wouldn't have these capabilities at all that are so critical to the contingencies that they're planning for. So I just give some examples here, like the S-400 can essentially guarantee a no-fly zone over Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands. S-35 other multi-role fighters are totally necessary for air dominance. And you know, a lot of the comparisons, I just have one here between the J-20 and the Su-57, some of the Russian fighters and the Chinese fighters. You might think, oh, they both have 5th generation fighters, or they both have 4th generation fighters. But actually, the Russian ones are still significantly better because of engine design. They're more maneuverable, which becomes increasingly important if you're engaged in dogfighting, for example. Slide, please. My conclusions about bilateral, and again, these are all just preliminary based on the arms sales. The overall project is hoping to disaggregate a number of variables in this similar way, but it doesn't seem like there's any indication that they're moving towards jointness in terms of systems. So it's not the case that they're trying to use, they're at the stage where their weapons and equipment are similar enough to really facilitate coalition warfare. I like the communication between them. Sure, China has, you know, a couple, you know, has some combat aircraft of Russia, but it's not the case that their militaries can easily communicate with one another. So it seems like jointness and the ability to fight together is not a main priority of these arms sales. But a lot of what I've pointed out suggests that there's other ways that that this sort of alignment between the two sides can cause issues. One, Russia is a reliable source of technology, weapons, and equipment for China, even during a conflict. And this minimizes the US abilities to coerce China or to deter China through denial. It hurts any US attempts to deny tech transfer that improves the lethality of the PLA, because even if, you know, the United States tried to, you know, prevent Boeing from, you know, engaging in some sort of agreement with a Chinese company because of civil military fusion, there's always the Russians that are there that are willing to provide those technologies to China. Also, it seems like the more they move towards those arms arrangements, and they're at very nascent stages now, it's possible that Russia can be an alternative center of production that's less vulnerable to attack for China. So they can provide each other with a strategic rear that's safe for attack, safe from attack, as escalation risk to attacking a country that's not technically in the fight is too high for the United States and its allies. And Russia can potentially enlarge mobilization capacity in the event of a large-scale war for China, which would be problematic and allow the contingencies we're thinking of. Slide, please. On the multilateral, I'll just say I don't see any indications that China and Russia are coordinating their arms sales policies, either in multilateral fora or to third parties. I am still looking into whether they protect each other from arms embargoes, but it doesn't seem like they're very proactively doing that. And this is important because, you know, one of the things is that the two, like Russia here, still sells military equipment to Vietnam and India, which China will potentially need to fight. That's why I didn't circle the, you know, do no harm. They haven't coordinated their policies enough such that they aren't selling to each other as potential adversaries. If you look at their arms sales, China and Russia only share 5 countries, of which they are the main suppliers, and only, you know, they're the only 2 countries that share Algeria as one of their top 3 main clients. What this suggests is that they aren't really coordinating their arms sales policies at this point. And so when we think about like what are China and Russia doing in terms of the scope of their alignment, some people might point out and say, oh, well, they're not doing this on international states, so they're not aligned. But I don't think that's very useful. I would say, yes, they are aligned to achieve aims in Asia, but the alignment scope has not extended to their foreign policies more broadly. Slide, please. So just to give you a little hint of what I'm thinking about, since I want to take Q&A now, you know, then we get into force employment. That was mainly about force development for, you know, how you help another country build a military. Now, what are ways that Russia or China can help each other's militaries perform better? It seems we have to disaggregate joint exercises, the timing, scenarios, tactics, practice, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, where it takes place, the units involved. All that seems to suggest different things about alignment, as well as the types of joint operations. Do they have access to each other's countries? Are they engaged in intel cooperation? Do they have embeds, consultation, logistics support, all of these sort of things? Again, I would disaggregate exercises and then try to measure where China and Russia are on this scale in terms of scope and depth. Slide, please. So it seems that if I'm looking at the ways that these two countries are cooperating to maximize the benefits accrued from using their militaries together or separately in peacetime and wartime, Russia and China are helping each other improve their tactical and operational capabilities to conduct unilateral operations. So what that means is they're helping each other have greater abilities to fight by themselves, not necessarily together. We have to look in the exercises in particular, and I'm still doing this on, it's not so much are they fighting together. What I'm interested in, if you look at this more broadly and disaggregate the variables, are they instituting and improving communication channels that facilitate some of the logistical support and enabling mechanisms that I've laid out? And if they're going to allow access to each other's territories, we'd see exercises within the territory. So it's actually more meaningful, and I've talked to some military planners about this, but it's more meaningful for Russia to invite China to one of their own exercises within Russia than it would be for the two of them to exercise, with South Africa, for example, because you're inviting another country in to have insight into your own strategic plan and your own thinking and to operate on your own soil. So it seems like that is a greater greater measure of alignment. Slide, please. So it looks like this one's a little bit off the page. The top line, this is just a rehashing of what I've said before. The China and Russia are unlikely to form this formal military alliance or fight together in their traditional sense or coordinate their policies towards third parties. But in some significant ways, the alignment is deep, though it's limited in scope, I think, right now to the region. And Russia right now is aiding China's rise, which makes it more challenging for the United States to compete with China, which I think is the bottom line issue here. And then my last slide on some concluding thoughts. So just to leave you with where I am on thinking about this, there seems to be some redundancy. I go back and forth about the depth of the alignment, the scope of the alignment, and the impact, right? Because they're all related in some way. So I've obviously, as most scholars, have written this paper in so many different ways, in which I start with scope and depth and then say, what is the impact? Or in this case, I say, how can states actually impact things? And then I try to get the indicators from that, but trying to discuss those various things is difficult. The second point about, military defense ends and/or means is the focus. So in some cases, you can think about China and Russia trying to help each other achieve defense and military ends with economic tools. So in that case, should I include economic measures? A lot of scholars have convincingly argued that economic measures are not a good indicator of alignment because they're mainly commercially driven. So I've sort of left them out so far, but I'd be interested in people's thoughts. And the last question, it looks like our slide has changed back. Go one slide forward. Yeah, perfect. Have I missed some ways that states can help each other? And I list the unilateral, bilateral, multilateral ways that can, that states can help each other achieve these goals, that then I should think about deriving indicators of alignment from that. So I will conclude there, take questions, feedback, responses, and I'm really looking forward to your views. Thank you again.
Thanks, Oriana. That was really interesting. Very enlightening, actually. And now we're going to have half an hour for questions and answers. But before we do that, we'd actually already asked Dr. Ian Henry from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, who is his research specialisation is in alliances. And Dr. Henry is going to give us, kickstart the discussion with a few thoughts of his own. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Sue. Oriana, this was a tour de force and a very impressive paper. If you can keep it as a paper and not as a book, I'll be extremely impressed, because it seems to me here that this would actually be a perfect sort of 100,000 word project. I think there's a lot of stuff to dig into, and I wonder too whether the theoretical contribution that this is obviously going to make might be expanded if other case studies were looked at as well. But I'll also email you some comments, so I'll try and keep these fairly brief to give other people a chance to chime in as well. On the theoretical point, I think that one of the main, there are two different ways at which this idea of alignment could be approached, and that's through the more narrow alignment literature, or it could be through the broader alliance literature. And some of this, I think, gets at a key question which I've written down as, are alignments subset of alliances, or are alliances subsets, a subset of alignments? And I think here that the differing schools within these literatures will actually have different views on it. I mean, Snyder quite clearly says that alliances are a subset of alignments, and then goes on to talk about them in that way. So I think, and it's not a flaw, but it's something that I think might sort of cause a visceral reaction among some people who approach it from the alliance literature, is to look at how you theorize this idea of alignment and think, well, where's the other stuff that contextualizes it with view to alliances? You know, you do a lot of great work on teasing out what the, you know, what Lim and Cooper and what Koritzer War and what other more alignment focused works say on it. But then there's kind of like the other end of the definition, where it seems to me that the way you define alignment creeps very close, and indeed I would probably say crosses over into how a whole bunch of other scholars actually define an alliance itself. And so I think, kind of in, again, putting my own old military hat on, getting the left and the right of arc on that definition are really important, and sort of, you know, defining it on one end and then also defining it on the other. All that said, I think you're right. I think that there is something here that the existing categorizations don't necessarily capture, and it's very hard when dealing with this kind of thing, because very often we want to amend an existing term or word or repurpose it for our own purposes. But it makes me wonder whether actually there would be value in at least thinking about whether what you're talking about as an alignment, is it like an alliance theorist, I think, would probably call it an informal alliance, or perhaps even a limited liability alliance. There are you know, sufficient convergent interests to encourage and prompt a variety of conscious, deliberate cooperation on certain security measures, particularly those ideas of capability that you've talked about, but they are not so convergent as to warrant the kind of commitment that a mutual defence treaty sends in today's context. And on that note as well, I think there's something here about where our modern conception of alliances, particularly post-World War II in Asia, may not actually be all that helpful for understanding the dynamics that are occurring today. And it may be more useful to go sort of back and look at those alliance classics that look at great power alliances in multipolar environments. So particularly that pre-World War I, World War II stuff in Europe. The sense I get is that your conception of alignment, this is how I would describe it, is kind of, is it in my state's interest for this other state with whom I'm aligned to be strong, powerful, and possessing some independent military weight? And my reasons for doing so might be because they could be a wartime ally in the future, or simply because I don't want them to be conquered or defeated in battle, because that would pose adverse consequences for my security. And in the paper, you talk a little bit about how this alignments don't involve shared interests in the same way that alliances do. To me, that interest, as I've just described it, is actually a really important shared interest. But again, it's not that kind of, I think we associate the mutual defence treaties with broad-ranging, we see the world 99% the same way and will cooperate on all manner of things. I definitely agree with you that there's something below that the current categorizations in the literature don't adequately get at. And to my mind, it reminded me of Glenn Snyder's concept of the alliance halo, where there are all these elements of cooperation that exist between two allies that aren't actually part of the treaty and are ancillary to it, and probably because of the regular cooperation that's conducted under the treaty. Particularly that do no harm principle that you talked about in your table, I'm pretty sure that Snyder himself talks about that as being part of the alliance halo. So it struck me as an area that might have some useful stuff to say about how to define this idea. I just got two quick comments on the stuff that you presented today. Your innovations on how to measure alignment, I think, are a real step forward. And as you started to talk about those, that was when I began to think, how on earth is this going to be a paper and not a book? So they were really interesting, and I think I agreed with you on most of those. And it raised for me the question of, you know, you could draw some comparisons, quite, you know, some quite interesting ones between the kind of the closest alliance that's probably existed on some of those measures, which I would probably say would be the bilateral relationship between the US and the UK, particularly how the US helped them with nuclear weapons and delivery systems. But I also thought that was a little bit of a challenge to some of your ideas about great powers, military bases, all those kinds of things. And finally, on the idea of the Russia-China relationship today, I agreed with I think almost everything that you said, but just one thing that occurred to me I thought I'd draw your attention to. Lyle Goldstein very recently was looking at some work done by a Russian scholar and essentially saying that there were these speculations that perhaps in some contingencies Russia would open up Arctic ports to Chinese SSBNs. And it struck me as a really interesting kind of thing that might be it may not be a present data point for your argument, but it could be the kind of future thing, you know, where alignments in a crisis scenario, obviously here Russia's interest in not seeing any conflict between China and the US escalating to the nuclear level, you might see really limited forms of military basing that could quite decisively affect US war planning, particularly in a Taiwan scenario. That's all I'll say for now because I want to give other people lots of time. But again, great paper, really enjoyed it and your talk today. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Oriana, did you want to make any comments on that, or because I have another question I can go to?
Yeah, I'll just say, Ian, thank you for those comments, and I'll definitely be bothering you again about a lot of this. You know, when you say that it might be a book, I just have to I laughed to myself because actually this project started out of a question I got in my military job, of which they were like, can you just give us one slide? So I still owe them that one slide. They're probably like, why have you been working on this for months and you haven't come up with an answer yet? But I kind of had that same feeling of like, there's just so much going on here. And arms sales was going to be like, you know, a paragraph. And now I have like 40 written pages about arms sales. So once I get the framework right, maybe a book is definitely a direction to go. So I appreciate all those comments, and I probably just take a lot of feedback, and I might not have anything sort of smart to say in response at this time, but I'm really looking forward to hearing people's questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, we do have some questions. Next person is Evelyn. Evelyn Go has the question.
Thanks, Sue. Oriana, again, congratulations. I think that this is a great project, and I think you've done huge amounts already, as you said. Two sort of comments and suggestions I think I've got, following on from what Ian has already offered. I mean, the thing that from your presentation, that more than from the paper, I think that really struck me as the potential contribution here to the literature is that, you know, for a long time now, the alliances stroke alignments literature has, you know, been obsessed with the one case of, you know, US alliances, right? Which means that de facto, we've really only been talking about asymmetrical alliances. And of course, there's an older, as Ian said, older literature on, you know, alliances that we might, and alignments that we might think of as being more symmetrical. And so I see, you know, your work as a corrective to that slant in the literature. And I take on board everything you said about the quality of great power to great power alignment being actually rather different than what is assumed in a large section of that asymmetrical alignment literature. So I'd really push that and encourage you to think about, first of all, giving a proper label to your framework, which, you know, I would think of as, yeah, a framework that, you know, as a great power strategic alignment framework. I think that's what you are sort of putting forward in what you presented there in that slide that had the, you know, details of it, and to be quite sort of upfront about that, because I think that's where you're entering the literature. And my other piece of sort of answer to you, one of the questions you asked, is that if I were you, I would actually focus quite starkly on the what I think of as the military defense elements of what you've done here, because to me that's where the very clear contribution is in terms of the material that you have, in terms of the analysis that you've already started to do. One danger I see in how you've cast it at the moment is, for example, when you have that slide about sort of how states help each other achieve foreign policy objectives in general, right? I think foreign policy objectives in general is a bit of a dangerous ground to go to because it covers all manner of sins. I would probably advise thinking about being quite focused on strategic policy, perhaps as a label, or even military strategic policy to reflect where your comparative advantage and the material you've got is. And then to really sort of hone in on that. The danger of the way you've kind of put it forward as foreign policy objectives more generally is, to my mind, when I saw that slide, I thought you were trying to do some new work on bringing together the alliances literature with that international cooperation literature. You know, how do states help each other in foreign policy objectives? And that suggests that, oh my goodness, there's going to be cooperation stuff coming in here, you know, which I kind of realized as you went on was not your aim. So,
yeah, I took one class with like Helen Milner and Bob Cohen on cooperation, and I was
it's
done.
just too broad a scope, I think. So that suggests that my other suggestion, and I'll stop here, is that of course the China-Russia relationship, you know, has, you know, a bit of a history, even in the more modern context. And so it just made me think, and maybe Sue too, that, you know, there's that Cold War. There's lots of Cold War data points for that kind of broad-based strategic alignment you're talking about between China and Russia too. They did a lot of this stuff in that period. So, you know, if you were going to sort of look at, Ian suggested looking at a number of different cases, but even within the China-Russia relationship, I think there are different temporal points that you could actually do some comparative work on if that's where you wanted to go. Thank you. Sorry for taking up so much time.
No, that's fine. And actually interesting you point that out with the Cold War relationship between them, Evelyn. When Oriana started her presentation, it sent me back to the document, National Security Council document 48/2, which was released in 1950 on US objectives towards Asia. And they specifically point out that their role is to divide the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And then it came full circle at the end of the Cold War when the United States then tried to mend the Sino-Soviet split by bringing Deng Xiaoping and Gorbachev together. So quite interesting. But anyway, Oriana, did you want to respond to that?
No, I think those are all great points. And on the different cases, I will say that I started researching US-China alignment in the 70s and 80s. And as a China specialist, I was just surprised with how I absolutely knew nothing about any of that. And a lot of the dynamics that I'm talking about now were present there. You know, the United States asking for a listening station within China, and China saying, sure, but only if it's, you know, only if it's Chinese who are doing it. So I think the historical cases would be very useful. It's nice to learn about new things.
Yeah, sharing of intelligence data from satellites, et cetera, for the South Asian crises and so on and so forth. Yeah, there was quite a lot there.
Okay, we have a question from Hunter Marston. He's got his hands up.
Hi, Oriana. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I'm glad you noted the provision of arms to Vietnam and India on Russia's part. And I'm wondering, how much does this complicate the tidiness of your theoretical direction? You know, it seems to me that it's not just the provision of arms and the strategic partnerships that Russia maintains with Vietnam and India, but also, you know, I'm sure you're aware that Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil corporation, does work in the South China Sea, which is really a point of friction for China. And this seems like a rather awkward interaction that the two aligned great powers have. So I wonder, how much does this sort of pull in the other direction of preventing deeper alignment? And is there, perhaps you'll be able to explain this away by saying, you know, I think alliance coordination is tighter perhaps, and alignment means that there's possibly more flexibility or maneuverability and frictions in these relationships, more nuance. Thanks, I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hunter, and it's good to see you. I mean, this is something that I have struggled with because, for example, I have put together like all the statements that Russia has made about the South China Sea, and then everything that China like either has officially said or all the Chinese writings about Crimea and like Ukraine. And one of the things that's brought up a lot is that like neither side is particularly supportive of the other. So this goes back to the question of like, with great powers, would you expect them to be very supportive, or is it enough that they're neutral? So I don't have a good answer for you. I think, but part of the question is, can they compartmentalize these sorts of things? Because one of the things I noticed looking at the historical cases that I found interesting is when the United States and China were aligned, the United States continued to sell arms to Taiwan, but China never brought it up publicly, right? So during their alignment, it's not that they resolved those issues. It is, how did they deal with the conflicting issues? Did they try to like mitigate it so it wouldn't affect the alignment, or did they solve it? So that's what I'm currently struggling with, that in sort of the great power alignment, because I think great powers, by definition, have so many interests. So they have conflicting interests, like naturally. So are they going to divide up spheres of influence, or, are they going to sort of accommodate each other, or are they just going to like say, oh, let's just pretend that never happened? So I'm not really sure at this point how to deal with those. But I do know that the current literature basically says, because they don't fully support each other or have these conflicting interests, they can never be aligned. And I don't think that's true, but I haven't come up with a good alternative yet.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it certainly makes it a very interesting story. Not something to just ignore.
Amy, the next person with the hand up.
Thanks, Oriana. Really enjoyed the paper. I also had the benefit of reading your draft conceptual paper, and both from that and the presentation, two things that really I thought were quite useful in the definition you're advancing and the approach you're taking are, first, the distinction you're making between shared interests and mutually beneficial ways of achieving the objectives. I think you're quite right that actually shared interests isn't all that analytically helpful to you, and I like the direction that you're taking, therefore. And the sort of the North Korea, South Korea, Japan case study that you sort of refer to in the paper illustrates that nicely. But I think more generally, mutual objectives makes mutually beneficial ways of achieving objectives makes sense there. I also was very much persuaded, I think, that starting with the objectives of the alliance and using that to derive the indicators is the right way round, rather than just collecting up a whole host of indicators. So that was very persuasive to me, and I think that's a real contribution that you can make, and what disaggregates you from so much of the sort of the policy commentariat sort of work on the China-Russia relationship, which sort of starts from, let's just observe what's been happening for the last year or two. So that was good. But I guess the one thing I kept coming back to in thinking about what is the key objective of this alignment between China and Russia, I accept, of course, that the United States is a feature in all of this, and the external other and the role of the United States there is key. But for me, equally important to driving the China-Russia alignment is the need to remove the source of threat in that bilateral relationship. I know much less about the Russia side, of course, but from the Chinese perspective, achieving great power dominance in East Asia requires you not to have an adversarial relationship in Russia. And that adversarial relationship with Russia, has been the dominant characteristic of the China-Russia relationship for centuries. It's a mere blip in kind of the 50s and 60s when they actually were aligned, and perhaps again today. And the United States certainly serves as an important motivating factor, so perhaps driving that alignment. But I think there's a deeper motivating factor there, which Russia has had long-standing ambitions in the Far East. If Russia really wanted to exert greater dominance in East Asia, then it would pose great problems for China. So I think sort of thinking about the internal dynamics of that bilateral relationship separate from the external other in the role of the United States is important there. And I note that in your own definition of alignment, you don't put the kind of the external balancing or defense against a third party in your definition, which I think is really useful as a result. So it leaves open the possibilities that, and as you referred to, I think of it in your presentation, that they may simply be aligning because they're trying to reduce or mitigate the conflicting interests or threat within that bilateral relationship itself. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks, Amy. And I have a comment, another hand up here is from Rowan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi, Oriana. Great to see you. Thank you, Evelyn and Sue, for inviting me to this event. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed the presentation. My question is a little bit, so I think at an intuitive level, it makes sense that Russia and China are trying to align or would be aligned. I'm focused a little bit more on the sort of measurement side of things. And so to me, you mentioned intentions, which are clearly an important piece of all of this. And I'm wondering if arms sales might be too noisy a measure of that. You know, especially if we sort of disaggregate the state, because your sort of framework takes the state as a unitary actor, at least it seems like it does. And what happens to intentions when you disaggregate the state? And I guess what I'm asking is, how much of this is driven by state level strategic intentions and how much by the economic imperatives and political economy of defense manufacturing, right? So arms sales are often shaped by the incentives of private manufacturers, both towards selling arms, but also refraining from arms for IPR concerns, intellectual property concerns, and not necessarily shaped by the willingness to lose relative power. So Russia sells similar levels and types of equipment to India as it does to China, like the S-400. But does that make India aligned with Russia? And if that's true, then is India aligned with both the US and Russia? That works. So arms sales as a measure itself seems to me a bit difficult to sort of reverse engineer intentions out of. And I'd be curious to hear your views on how it fits into sort of your other metrics and whether we can say more about, its role in that. Thank you.
I'll just make a quick comment to both Amy and Rohan. You guys both have asked questions that pinpoint two issues of two other projects that I have. One is on how to decipher and measure intentions, which I have like a 50-page paper presented at Notre Dame right before the shutdown that I'm still like struggling with. And then how do we understand competition? So Amy, to your point about like, trying to reduce their threat to each other, that's absolutely the case. I have this whole other project in which I'm trying to understand how states compete in like the peacetime environment. And that, that is a key component is making sure you don't have to deal with the threat of another country. And so this is, I think, the arms sales, for example, the S-400, I guess what I was trying to say is exactly that, because India is different than China. The S-400 might not be a sign of alignment with India, but is a sign of alignment with China, given that India and Russia are not going to be fighting wars against each other, given that they're not like potential adversaries the way that Russia and China are, especially in terms of, the history of their sort of nuclear relationship. So the fact that Russia was willing to do that. Now you bring up the point of the incentives of private manufacturers. And that's why I try to break it down a bit to, like, as I say, like, you have these pooling equilibrium in which, a state's going to sell whether they're aligned or not aligned. So are there certain indicators that can tell us they would only do this if they were actually more aligned? Or to Amy's point, at the very least, Russia has decided that, China is no longer a threat to them in the near term. As you know, they just stopped their sales or their transfer of S-400s to China recently. So I don't know what that means, but that's kind of what I'm trying to get at is this issue of the indicators. Does it mean something different based on the countries that are involved? And my hunch is yes. But I haven't come up with like maybe, a broad enough or maybe narrow enough framework to help us address some of those issues. So I agree with all those points that were made. There's definitely things that I'm thinking very deeply about, but I haven't been able to straighten out completely in my own mind yet.
Okay, and we had a question here in the chat. There was one here from Bill, who talks about the question of dividing China and Russia with in terms of war and then uniting them in terms of peace. And did you want to make a comment about whether you see anything like that, or we can take that as a comment?
Well, I'll just say one of the big questions of why this matters is I'm trying to figure out, like, is it worth our effort to try to divide these countries? And if it was, like, how should we go about doing it? I think before we can answer those questions, we have to understand what the nature of the relationship is and the impact that it has on the region. But I'm definitely, partially driven by those questions to try to come up with a good answer in the end. And then, of course, my advisor, Tom Christensen, wrote a whole book about how actually if two countries like China and Russia are divided and competing against each other, it actually creates more problems in the international system than if they were united. So that's probably, something that I'll have to deal with once I come up with answers to the former questions.
So if I may,
yep.
Just before we all go off, I'm just going to post in the chat box for everybody the link to the seminar website, where Oriana has also provided a small number of suggested readings that relate to this topic. So if you're interested in that, please have a look. Just follow the link that is now in the chat box. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks,
and I'm just going to post quickly my email to people. For those of you that didn't enter early and just didn't hear us chatting, I am calling from Sydney, and I am in Australia somewhat indefinitely, at least until August. And so hopefully at some point, we can continue these exchanges, of course, remotely, but, we do plan on coming to Canberra sometime in the new year. And so it would be very useful, if you're interested in connecting and continuing this conversation, other conversations further in person, please send me a note.
Thank you, Oriana. And in fact, that is really good, as also the reading list, because this is a topic that has lots, lots that one can unpack from. And even just from my perspective as a historian, there's a lot to unpack from the history, or the post-war history of the Soviet-China relationship as well, even to understand that, let alone looking into the contemporary period. But thank you very much for that presentation, and also thank you everybody who made a comment. It was a very, very thoughtful and insightful session.